also congrats. Recordings in progress. Congrats to everybody who won the scholarship, or sorry, the grant. That all of your talks have been very interesting. So very fascinating to hear more. Sorry, I wasn't close enough. So yes, as you've heard, I focus primarily on red-tailed hawks and growing cities. I want to focus especially on urbanization, meaning just growing cities and density of these cities and how they relate to our backyard ecosystems. So I am from the University of Northern Colorado, and a little bit about me is I am a graduating senior as of this semester, focusing for my major in biology, emphasis in ecology, evolution, kind of what we said. I'm so sorry, I'm quiet. Thank you. And I'm also minoring in GIS, which is Geographic Information System. So if you're like, what is that? I make maps on the computer. It can be a little frustrating, but you know, it's really fun. And I, like we said, I use they, them pronouns. If you want future resources on what that kind of looks like, I've provided a link for you. Now then, my study. So I have discussed a lot on red-tailed hawks, and very recently I thought that I could throw in some osprey, and boy howdy did we. Currently my, like we said, my research is most extensive with red-tailed hawks. You'll see that abbreviation throughout my presentation of RTHA. I am also focusing on human populations, and they are large, they are increasing. And as a result, there is a lot of trash accumulation, and immediate and surroundings, or our immediate surroundings and even distant ecosystems suffer due to prolonged negligence. There was an analysis by the World Wildlife Organization Fund that came out in 2019 that surveyed many people and different researchers, indicating that we consume approximately about 1 credit card's worth of plastic every week. Should I say that again? Okay, I'll say it again. I'm sorry. We consume about 1 credit card's worth of plastic every week. This comes in forms of microplastics. If you think about potatoes that are wrapped in saran wrap, we consume plastic because of how it enters our watersheds, our food systems, so on and so forth. So it's kind of a lot of plastic. What about birds? Why this study specifically? First, kind of going to do some crowd engagement here. I am really curious that if we were to think about 3 wild animals, what are the first things that come to mind? I'll go first. I like to think of bears, I think of penguins, and I think of lions. Does anybody want to go? Like, raise your hand. Maybe just give me 1 animal. I don't care. Speak up. Like I'm learning how to. Yeah. Wolves. Wolves. I love it. Yeah, that's a really good one.
Raccoons.
Raccoon.
Wild dog.
Wild dogs. Yeah.
Red-tailed hawk.
Red-tailed hawk. Wow, I wonder where that came from. Yeah, so we kind of got an idea of, for the most part, these are larger mammals, right? So obviously we found that there is, you know, yeah, red-tailed hawks, sure. Penguins, a couple of birds, primarily mammals, right? And there's a reason we think of a lot of these animals when you're like, oh, here's a wild animal. I don't know. I think of like a seal in Antarctica. So what does this have to do with my study? Well, charisma and conservation go really hand in hand. If I were to say charismatic megafauna, a lot of studies actually focus on what this means, and there's not a hard set definition, but rather an accumulation of what people define for themselves. And this looks a lot like large animals, elephants, something that can be anthropomorphized. So dogs, we co-evolved with, right? Pretty easy to say, hey, that's a dog, and I feel very strong empathetic emotions towards this dog. Then there's also things like umbrella species. Umbrella species are essentially a type of animal that if they were to receive funding for conservation efforts, their entire ecosystem would benefit from that. Okay, so conservation marketing actually can gear a lot towards charismatic megafauna and umbrella species using these terms. And so This is just a lot of basic psychology that kind of comes into play. And since PowerPoint designed all of this for me, I'm not great with PowerPoint. We have a lion, and so I thought, hey, what about Timon and Pumbaa? They benefit from a lion getting some conservation efforts, right? So going back to birds, the backgrounds. I initially was evaluating a lot of this to complete my capstone, if I'm being completely honest. And thankfully, Dr. Benedict, who is my research advisor, approached me and said, hey, what if you did research with me? And I said, cool, you got it. Come to learn a lot about myself that, oh, this is actually going to be really interesting. So one of the comprehensive studies that I came across was Life in a Polluted World, a global review of anthropogenic materials in bird nests. So if you hear the word anthropogenic, we can break it down, human-made. It came from us. So in the scientific community, it seems like there's a lot of focus on different major populations of bird species, and we kind of seem to forget other populations exist. So Dr. Benedict or Lauren will very frequently tell you that she studies females in bird species. There's such a huge focus on male species, right? But if you're only looking at one portion of the ecosystem, well, you're missing the rest, right? And so it's kind of important. And I was curious how this might affect marine birds versus terrestrial birds. And to further define terrestrial birds for you, I'm not talking about ostriches. I know it seems kind of like, oh, the things with legs that can't fly, emus, peppers. No, just birds that really exist more in a landlocked area. Okay, like Colorado, for example. Osprey. Oh wait, that's what I studied. Okay. Sorry, I'm kind of silly. This study, as we mentioned, focused a lot on how different studies evaluated human impact on birds. Okay, so a lot of the interesting points they came up with was how debris is going to be used or incorporated into certain nests. So the Chinese bulbul, as depicted here, there was a study done in China that evaluated exactly what I'm doing, but with one of their more local species. Okay, and they found that due to the lack of natural resources, these birds tend to use trash that was near them because that was a more abundant resource. Also, if you are curious about checking out any of these studies, I would highly recommend it. They will be at the end of my presentation. Now then, I also want to emphasize that just because it is the results or symptom of us does not mean it's bad. Okay, birds can adapt. This is seen in the great gray shrike. They have been noted to use polypropylene strings. It's a little bit of a tongue twister for me, to strengthen their nests. There is, results that indicated it helped protect nests and eggs. There is still also the possibility that, adults and young may become entangled, thus affecting their longevity. I'm sure a fair amount of us know bowerbirds, right? I'm not gonna be too dorky about it, or am I? We're here for birds. This increased their odds of mating, and so what bowerbirds will do is they will erect this, or male bowerbirds will erect these large structures called bowers in order to gain mates. This could be very indicative of relative fitness, meaning how attractive the females perceive them. And for birds who coordinated more with stronger colors and bigger objects, bigger bowers, they had higher rates of mate acquisition, meaning they reproduced quite a bit. I thought this study was actually incredibly interesting because they took the black kites, did something a little bit more unique with anthropogenic waste. And they were trying to mark the quality of individuals in territory. Okay, so with a nest, they found that a social hierarchy would be established, and black kites that were within a very fit reproductive range, so about 5 years old to 11 years old, they saw that they used more white trash, very specifically white trash, to enunciate the eggs in their nest, which seems kind of weird, right? It is across. I thought it was here at least. So what that kind of signaled was, hey, these are my eggs. I was able to get all of this trash, put it in my nest with my mating pair. And these guys gonna grow up to be big and strong. Don't mess with us. Okay. It was essentially a warning of saying, I am super high up on that social hierarchy. Don't mess with me. And a lot of the reviewers tried to kind of put trash into older birds, younger birds' nests, and they found that they would suffer some pretty like aggressive attacks. So while there is the possibility of dishonest signalers or cheaters, you know, if maybe I'm 1 to 2 years old and I'm breeding and maybe not quite fit enough and decided to throw some trash into my nest and can't really ward off some more fit individuals, I would suffer a lot for it. And I know like maybe we're not too thrilled about graphs, but I thought I'd squeeze one in there from not my study. I should clarify that. So you'll see that the offspring raised and survival were directly correlated, and there would be more numbers of offspring and more survival, a higher survival rate in birds that had more white trash in their nests or for black kites. So then we also had the possibility of repelling ectoparasites, so things like mites and lice. And this study was also very interesting. It looked at house sparrows and house finches, and specifically how they utilized cigarette butts. Okay, I actually reviewed this with the Dr. Benedict lab, and it was actually really funny because they found that the scientists involved had machines that were specifically assigned to smoke cigarettes to kind of compare what an unsmoked cigarette was like, how frequently those were utilized in that versus a smoked cigarette. Smoked cigarettes were way more incorporated into, and they also specified Marlboro Reds. So I know. And what they found was the burnt nicotine actually repels the presence of ectoparasites. There was a lower load of ectoparasites. So these birds stayed pretty okay for themselves. All right, so why red-tailed hawks? And my mouth gets a little dry. I'm gonna get some water. Okay, red-tailed hawks. Honestly, I don't know. At first, I didn't know. After I started to evaluate more bird species that were fairly common within Colorado and especially nationwide, because I wanted a big sample to kind of choose from, different photos essentially. And I'll get more into that here in a second. Also, they have been known to nest on, you know, human buildings, a lot of AC units, roofs, things like that. This image on the left, I actually took. There was a young red-tailed hawk juvenile I found in the summer of last year. And I was very pleased because this was like the most successful trip I had throughout the entire summer. So a little bit about red-tailed hawks is, like I said, they will nest in trees, buildings. They don't tend to discern too much. Raptors, they'll eat small animals. I'm sure we already know this. They are low concern conservation level. They are very common. You'll see from this map over here, the purple essentially means they are here year-round. They don't really migrate. So I also included a little fun fact is, did you know that when you are watching a movie and you hear a screech from a bald eagle, that's not a bald eagle, that's a red-tailed hawk. Right. Yeah, bald eagles actually sound a little dorkier in my opinion, but elegant. So predictions and hypothesis, I'm sure you can read this, I'll read it for you as well. Red-tailed hawks will have an increase of anthropogenic waste materials incorporated into nests and higher usage of man-made buildings to nest on in closer proximity to larger human populations. Let me condense that for you. Predictions and hypothesis again. So we see a big city. The bigger the city, I'm predicting that there will be more human impact, essentially. This is actually an off-prey nest. There is trash in the nest and it is located on top of the cell tower. So we could definitely say, yeah, I think humans have directly and indirectly impacted this species in this nest, at least in this photo. So I worked a lot with secondary data. I know you all probably already know Macaulay Library, eBird. We're all here for birds, I know. But so a lot of this relied on open source data from birders such as yourselves. So in advance, thank you. It actually helps me get some very fascinating data, and I'm sure you'll agree. I also worked a lot with Excel. I was bad at Excel before, and now I wouldn't say a pro, but I'm better. And then also many open source sites for GIS. Later, I will further expand on that as well. So looking at the Macaulay Library, I had specifically sampled 355 unique nests. So I ended up having to go into Excel specifying that I only want novel coordinates. They cannot be repeated. If they are repeated, sure, it could give me a different angle, but I don't want to skew my data as much as I can possibly control. And all of these were evaluated for human impact for some simple categories. The simple categories, at least for red-tailed hawks, were if they nested on a building, a man-made building, if there was waste present in the nest, and essentially how far away was this nest from the nearest dense population. And I'll go over my criteria for dense population here in a second. So like I said, I worked a lot with Excel. My data was stored, evaluated, and reviewed. A number of times that made me want to have like my eyes bleed, essentially, too much. I worked very closely with ArcGIS Pro. It is my minor, so hopefully I'm adept at it. So this program helps me analyze all of my data in a spatial manner. So just basically maps, right? So the process, again, this is just the criteria I had was anthropogenic waste present, unintended for use man-made building. This specifically is actually from my osprey data because I found in the 355 nests for the red-tailed hawk, they did not nest on any stands. Osprey did, obviously. And also intended building bird stand. So just what I said. This required a lot of patience. So many of the photos were not good to use just because of how blurry they were, or when I filtered through the Macaulay Library, looking specifically for nests, they would have the tag for nests, but they would not show the nests themselves. If the picture would be cropped in a way that it was just above the nest, which is like, that's not what I wanted, but okay. So essentially, I then made it easy for Excel and me to use by just using binary ones and zeros to say, yes, this is present. No, that wasn't present. So again, with kind of involving you guys, I'm curious as to what you think the involvement here is. Zeros and ones. And I promise I gave you some easier photos. So if it's kind of hard to see, don't look too hard, okay? Would you give this a 1 or a 0? And for which category would you give that a 1 or a 0? 0 meaning no human impact, 1 meaning there's impact for this category, okay? And I'll remind you of the categories again. Is it on a bird stand? Is it on a building? Or is there waste, trash, plastic, anywhere in the nest? Feel free to just holler out. Zeros across the board, you got it. You're kind of getting the idea of what that felt like for me. Next one, green smiley face. You know, it's okay, right? All right, this one, same questions. What do you guys think? 1, for which category? Yeah, buildings. Should I move? Okay, okay. Yeah, and here's an arrow as if you couldn't see the building. All right, what about this one? 1 for waste, you got it. And again, if you can't see it, look at that. I'm a pro with animation on PowerPoint. All right, so secondary data results. I'll be coming back to this. So if you're like, wow, that's a lot of numbers, don't worry about it. I got you, okay? So essentially what we found is that, yes, indeed, the closer the bird nest is to a city, you will see more human impact, okay? You'll also notice that I have in parentheses here, here, and here, the number of nests I found that were impacted through this category, okay? So for their anthropogenic waste in nests, there's only 4, which surprised me, actually. Nests on buildings, there were 48 out of 355. And all nests, they had an average distance between the nearest major city border of 27.16 miles. Okay. And I'll read this one to the side, 19.17 miles for nests on buildings, and then about 3.52 miles for nests that were just had waste in them. Okay. If you want to break it down into percentages because you like proportions like I do, I did that for you as well. Constructed building nests have about 13.52%. Anthropogenic waste had about 1.13%. So pretty minimal, but not nothing. Okay. So here are the maps I made. I wish I could make this a little bit bigger, but because I wanted to encapsulate all of the US, this is kind of what we're working with. For this map in particular, you'll see that it's called a core clef map. Okay. The more intense the color, the denser that county is. Okay. And all of these little parcels here, those are all county. Obviously, we know what our state is. And then major city boundaries I highlighted in blue. Nests on buildings. So they're pretty dispersed, and you can see they seem pretty close to a lot of the major cities, right? And we'll go ahead and move to the next one. Okay, this one was waste impacted nests. So there's about, you can only see 3, but 2 of them, which I promise they are unique values, are kind of on top of each other. So it kind of scaled a little wonky, but you know, same premise. And then for this one, this was all unimpacted nests. Okay, so they're everywhere, right? And this is pretty indicative of that. And we can also see that it seems like a lot of the nests are surrounding major cities anyway. We'll get into that here in a second as well. Here's some bar graphs. Just because I'm also a visual person. No impact, buildings only, and waste only. These were the average miles that was between the nests and the nearest city border. Okay, just a different way of visualizing it essentially. And of course, on top I had error bars. I'd like to thank Leah Crenshaw for helping me with those. In short, yes, the data does suggest that red-tailed hawks prefer natural materials. They are much cleaner than what I was expecting, especially hearing through, you know, various people and a lot of about red-tailed hawks. They tend to nest on man-made buildings. I was surprised. However, that doesn't mean there isn't a measurable impact on these nests. As you already saw, the closer the nest was to a major city, the more impacts we saw. And again, that does not mean it's a bad thing. Unfortunately, with red-tailed hawks, that kind of is a bad thing, just because they weren't nesting on stands. So here comes the really fun part that I had a really great honor of doing all of last summer. Was what about Colorado? Great question. Glad you asked. I took everything that I learned and threw it right into my backyard with a 3-hour drive distance radius. And so I was honored with the responsibility of researching these guys and received a couple of grants as well from UNC. It was very momentous for me, actually. Emotions. Brainstorming methods. I had to go back out into the field and challenge myself, and with a skill set I didn't really have, that I had through secondary data, but not a lot of problem solving out in the fields. So a lot of this, I had to troubleshoot as I was researching, and of course troubleshooting.
You can keep going.
Okay. I'm gonna have to wait because it's not quite reading the clicker. There we go. Okay. All right. So essentially, when I went out, I found that a lot of the nests I was looking for were not there. Why? Yeah, I'm still trying to figure that question out, honestly. I have a lot of ideas and hypotheses as to why, But essentially what it was is the new sheet I have requested from the Macaulay Library have a lot of unique values for Colorado, but all of these, we'll say like different nests on a sheet weren't there because of photos. This was all just raw data, unconfirmed raw data, okay? So I'm sure you already see the issue with that, of it being unconfirmed. Most of these I realized did not have pictures because my filter that I used was within the past year and within a 3-hour drive radius from where I lived. So I don't want to be driving too much. Yeah, too expensive for that. And I definitely encountered a couple of issues. So again, troubleshooting. So Dr. Benedict, who is a part of the a Google groups, sent out an email on my behalf where a lot of people such as yourselves, and maybe even a couple of you, I don't know, I know Jesse did, emailed back to me specific sites that you saw. And most of the data that I was able to gather and accomplish with like ease of access. Wow. Thank you for thorough notes, by the way. Super helpful. Some of you were like, yeah, if you are facing northeast at 2:30, not quite that specific, but it was pretty specific and it made it really helpful for me. So thank you. And then going back to troubleshooting, a lot of these nests were on areas or different properties that were public, but the way to get to them was immediately looking not public. So I had to go back and reestablish an efficient way of gathering my data, which is where Survey 123 comes in. I don't know if any of you are familiar with it. Maybe, maybe not. I'll show you a couple of screenshots here in a moment. And I had to kind of essentially upload some layers that showed me trails, roads, any way I could manage to get myself into the general vicinity of where this red-tailed hawk nest might have been. So this is Survey 123 that I have worked very closely with and absolutely drained the crud out of my battery on my phone. On the far left is actually ArcGIS Explorer. This is a free app, but you do need to have a license to actually upload a map to it, which is, interesting. And these were just a few of the nests that I had found. All of these little pins that you see that I have dropped, I made notes on those nests. Or these were nests that I said, no good, I can't even find the bird, so I have to move on. Over here is where I established a survey for me to go back and have a very consistent and efficient way of me reviewing my notes, because sometimes my handwriting is not that great. You learn some things about yourself. So this was really helpful in terms of today's date and time, weather conditions, because I was also curious about their behavior. And then Survey 123 is, I love this, okay? This is just, where's my location right now? Because the amount of times that I was Googling, what are my current coordinates? And then you have to wait for a while because Lord knows that you may or may not have cell data in that moment. And then insert a picture, which is very important for me to have. So perspective through a lens, through an even bigger lens. These are not the best quality images, but you're also looking at it through my scope through my phone. Okay, so some of the light's going to get warped and weird, but essentially all of these nests and this bird that I pointed out before are pictures I took myself, and I don't know, it was just such a cool experience. I was lucky enough to be able to go with Dr. Benedict on a birding trip here in Fort Collins. I had expressed a set amount of frustration of like, I can't find any of these nests. I can only see the birds. I swear they're taunting me. And I actually have a funny story about that here in a second. And there came a certain point where I was just super concerned that anytime I stepped outside with a scope on my back, really big backpack, notebook ready to go, that somebody was going to be like, that looks suspicious. Better call the cops. That did not happen, thankfully, but paranoia will get you. So I gave myself a medal for that. Okay. For Dr. Benedict, spotted any bird we saw that day first, which makes sense. She's an ornithologist, right? But it was still just like, dang, where are my eyeballs? All right, so I finally compiled my data, and you'll see that it is basically along I-25. Okay, it is very mid-range map. And again, human density population, blue is major cities. Nests visited, I had about 10 of them that had no measurable impact at all, at least from what I could see. And I really made sure to take lots of photos, get as many angles as possible. But going back to this one, this guy, obviously a one in built his nest on, or his parents built a nest on a building. Again, if you're interested in graphs, the average distance between any of these nests and the nearest major city border was about 1.34 miles. Okay, pretty close. And then there's this photo. Not a great photo, but you'll see there is a red-tailed hawk. And I essentially was texting my husband, and I was saying, the amount of birds that I have seen today and no nest has been absolutely frustrating. And I sent him this picture, literally in all caps. I know this is lovely font right here, but in all caps, like, please just tell me where your home is. And then, you know, every now and then he would text me and be like, what does your day look like? And I said, all birds. Because I'd be out in the field or sitting on the computer, and essentially that ended up becoming our shorthand for my day is really busy. What about you? It's all birds. So let's compare species. I do kind of want to backtrack a little bit because I see I forgot a slide. Is there are some certain biases that I kind of want us to think about when it comes to my primary data and my field study. I am relying solely on information based off of people who may have certain limitations. Okay, it may be that certain red-tailed hawk nests were directly in their backyard. Maybe they don't typically go out into a forest, Arapaho Roosevelt's, anything like that. And so all of this information may be skewed because in terms of accessibility, people are more likely to report nests seen if it is close and within a accessible distance rather than, I don't know, I'm going to go 3 hours into a forest, may not have cell data, may not have accurate information and report it there. So again, this is not like I scoured the ends of the earth, every single inch of my backyard in Colorado to figure out red-tailed hawk nests. For one, I can't even find the nest that's near me, and I see a mating pair every summer, right where I live, and we'll nest. So that's fun. It's so much harder to find that than it is the actual bird. So let's compare species. Going back to secondary data, I wanted to evaluate osprey. Even though they do nest near, they're fish eaters, they nest near bodies of water, they're not like marine salinity, they're not sea or ocean birds, right? So they nest near water terrestrially. Raptors, again, they'll eat small animals. And then they are low concern, but we see lots of conservation efforts with them. This bird would actually be an excellent picture to put next to charismatic megafauna in your dictionary, if you are weirdly inclined to do so. Their nesting behaviors are relatively similar to red-tailed hawks in terms of they will nest on just about anything. And the contrast you'll see is actually very fascinating. Okay, so going back to big numbers, I'll break it down for you. This data was so expansive, I had to come up with additional criteria to grade them in. I was curious if trash and where they nested in terms of intended for bird use, not intended for bird use, was correlated to any degree. It was, interestingly enough. And maybe not in a linear way, but it was correlated. So I made sure I had a similar sample size of 355 nests. Okay, there was an average distance of 34.66 miles between the nest itself and all 355 nests and the nearest major city border. Bird stands and waste, so meaning they were on a bird stand and had probably some agricultural twine or fishing line in their nest. There was an average distance of 31.46 miles. Not a huge difference, but something to note, right? Bird stands only, that was really interesting, and I'm still coming up to theories as to why. They were the furthest But again, just because there is human impact noted, does not mean it's a bad thing. We are working to help our neighboring ecosystems thrive, and that's actually what this is indicating, okay? Buildings and waste had 31.07 miles. Buildings only increased about 34.21 miles. Waste only was roughly 20 miles. Unimpacted sat at a happy Goldilocks medium of roughly 30 miles, okay? And again, percentages, we have bird stands and waste. 14.1% of my entire sample size had bird stands and waste involved in their nests. Bird stands only were about 25.4%, which is already wildly larger than what we saw in red-tailed hawks, right? Okay, 9.6 for buildings and waste. Buildings only was about 28%. Waste only 6.5. Unimpacted was about 16.9% of my entire sample size. All right, we'll get back to the pretty pictures. Again, maps I made and similar coloring. Man-made buildings and anthropogenic waste is the dark purple. The lighter purple is man-made buildings only. So dark purple is, you know, they fit 2 criteria instead of 1. This one I actually have the ability to have 3 or 4 nests within Alaska. So that's interesting. I'll move on to the next one. This is for bird stands and waste, and then just bird stands. It follows a little bit of a similar pattern in terms of especially like where the nests are located along the coast. And then for anthropogenic waste only is the dark purple squares. And there's none in Alaska for that one. And going back to our nice fun light blue plus sign, no measured impact. All right, so if you want to break down this onto a bar graph, I went ahead and did that for you as well. Okay, so results, essentially, the distance of densities has an impact. It definitely has an impact. I would say pretty comfortably for at least osprey. The behavior does tend to vary between species as well. So we already saw with the red-tailed hawk that there was an impact, but they definitely seemed a lot more selective in where they nested, or if there's any trash, they were cleaner, so to speak. Osprey, I have a bookmark on my Chromebook where it's gross birds. Okay, it is only photos of osprey because there's just so much gunk in their nests for a lot of these photos that I found. So, and like I've been saying, is an important note to have is human impact does not mean it's only a negative. We've been seeing a positive, we've been seeing some mixed results, and we've been seeing a negative for sure. But based off these studies, not just mine from the comprehensive review and my study as well, we can see that it varies among bird species. Some birds may choose not to adapt as much as red-tailed hawks have shown. Other birds, I'm not sure if there's any benefit to have trash in their nest, but we know that with them choosing to locate their nest on bird stands, they have more survivability, they have more charisma, they have more popularity going for them, right? There's a lot of bird cameras over these bird nests to bring attention to where they are located. Finally, I want to say a huge thank you to Dr. Lauren Benedict, the advisor for my research, the Benedict Lab, for Leah, Christina, Amanda, Karina, and Chris. For Dr. Lee and Dr. Salo, for any GIS issue I had, they were my go-to. Ian Bonner, my husband. Yeah, thank you. And my friends. And you, this would not be possible without any of the secondary data. So keep doing what you're doing. It is providing wonderful results. Here's my sources used. And yeah. There's just an extra side.
Thank you so much, Eric.
you.
Don't run away. We're
Okay. I'm here.
despite our technical problems, we do have some time for questions. Now, if you're on the Zoom meeting, just type your question into the chat window, And we'll relay that to Ash here in the room. Raise your hand. We'll take questions one at a time. So the floor is open for questions.
Everybody don't come running at once. Yeah, go for it.
All the studies, did you ever see any raptors that were entangled in there?
No, thankfully.
Can you repeat each question for
Yeah.
their benefit?
Okay, so her question was, did I see any raptors when I was out in the field or pictures taken? Did I see any raptors that were entangled in any of the anthropogenic waste? No, thank God for that. I did not. I was not traumatized in any way by horrible things. So thankfully, no. Great question.
Yeah, Leah Crenshaw asking, hey Ash, I didn't bring up, or I realize you didn't collect this data explicitly, but did you notice trends in the types of anthropogenic waste that you were finding in the hospitals?
Okay, so should I repeat that one since it's in the same chat? Okay. Hi Leah. Also, yes, I did. Especially with osprey, I saw most nests that had trash in the nest. It was either the polypropylene string or it was fishing wire or fishing line. There was a couple of pieces of articles of clothing for some of the nests, but for the most part, it was lines.
Mhm.
Yes, thank you. Yeah.
I don't know if you'll be able to answer this, but my question is whether you think in the Macaulay Library data, there's sort of a bias for people wanting their photograph to look natural. So they might be framing the photograph so that you can't see trash in the nest, or
I did
can't
actually.
tell that it's on a building
Yeah,
even.
no, that's a really great question. And again, so he was asking if people were intentionally taking photos or maybe even subconsciously that made the nest look more natural or more, I don't know, aesthetically pleasing so that there wasn't trash or any buildings visual. And I did take that into account actually. So if I could not see at least the base of the nest and what it was standing on, I had to presume that that data set was invalid and I would have to move on to the next photo because I wanted as complete information as you can get from secondary data such as that. Yeah.
Maybe unrelated question, but it's due to the avian flu and whatnot. Is there any sense that there are fewer hawks and raptors in Australia this past year as compared to?
I don't actually know. Okay, so his question was due to the increase in avian flu cases, is there now a decrease in reported populations? Because my focus was mostly on nesting, I wasn't looking too closely at the date unless I was specifically filtering for nests that I was going to go find myself, and that was before any of this exploded to the degree that it's in right now. So I can't say for certain, but I'm sure there might be less. I did have a question from Jesse, an email a while ago, a little bit, where there was a dead red-tailed hawk in somebody's yard, I think, and you were asking because it was next to a dead goose. And she was essentially asking, well, would a red-tailed hawk eat a goose and then contract avian flu? And based on my research, yeah. They can scavenge. It's not typically like super common, but they can scavenge, and because they're birds, they'll contract avian flu and possibly pass away. Almost certainly pass away. Yeah.
Maybe that's what the question, just some input for maybe why a lot of the listings on the Macaulay Library might not have pictures with it. I know a lot of people don't like to take pictures in nests, so they don't want to attract lots of other people to that might.
That's an excellent point. And I should say for the secondary data, obviously that was specifically, all of that research was only geared towards photos. When I was going out for Colorado, I forgot to repeat that question. So that statement. So he was just saying that just because some of the information that is being reported, some people may not take a picture of that nest to not have so many people flock to that nest and cause some weird issues. So again, when I was looking for stuff for Colorado, it was just based on what the Macaulay Library had for the most recent year, half a year, and not for any photos at all, which totally makes sense. It's also less time consuming and maybe more mentally accessible to not take photos, but just report like, yeah, there's a nest here. All right, on to the next bird.
Mhm.
So what do you think, where do you think you're going from here with red-tailed hawks? Are you gonna be studying them more, or are you gonna be moving on to more ospreys or a different bird entirely?
I think it was a perfect world. I would move on from red-tailed hawks just because I would love to keep comparing species against each other and how behavior would differ, just as I did with osprey. So I'd probably do field studies with osprey next and continue the process that I've been doing. Secondary data, field studies, secondary data, field studies.
Good.
All
All
right, thank
right.
you all so much for
Well,
having
one more
me.
thing. That was wonderful. Thank you. I'm supposed to make one more announcement before we sign off.